12:01 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, April 1st, 2026. The reading is exactly 0. What federal surveyors and glaciologists in the Columbia Mountains of British Columbia are witnessing right now changes every projection, every risk model, and every timeline for Canadian water security. It is not just a low water year. This is the complete collapse of a structural system that sustains the Canadian West. Right now, more than 40 million people across British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and 2 territories are dependent on a river network that is vanishing faster than any model predicted, and the physical mechanisms that generate that water have functionally ceased to operate. We are standing on the precipice of a full hydrological failure. The numbers coming in this hour are not anomalies. They are indicators of systemic breakdown. 130 telemetry stations across the upper Columbia Basin, from the Selkirks to the Rockies, are registering a snow water equivalent of 0%, a number so profoundly low that it means 2026 is worse than every single year ever measured since record-keeping began over a century ago. The impacts are instantaneous and cascading. The critical water that should be stored as snow, waiting to replenish reservoirs, is gone. In just the last month, Kinbasket Lake, the massive reservoir behind Mica Dam and one of the largest in North America, has dropped by 1.1 meters. That is not a seasonal fluctuate, it is a structural decline. Revelstoke Lake is tracking toward the minimum operational elevation, a critical point below which its massive turbines face an imminent shutdown for the first time in history. The crisis has left the sphere of scientific prediction and is now driving emergency response. The city of Kelowna in British Columbia has just ordered mandatory Stage 4 water restrictions, prohibiting all non-essential use, as municipal supplies dwindle to dangerous levels. Ski resorts across the BC interior, usually operating well into May, are closing weeks early as slopes dissolve into bare rock and mud. The Ktunaxa Nation has been forced to make the devastating decision to scale back agricultural planting on their lands in the Kootenay region, because there is simply not enough water in the rivers to sustain food production. Perhaps most critically, the 7 Canadian provinces and territories that share every drop of this interconnected river system have missed their federal deadline to negotiate new water-sharing agreements. They are at a political impasse, precisely when the hydrological reality demands unprecedented cooperation. But this crisis is not just a data point. It has faces and names. At 10:18 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on April 1st, 2026, a federal survey team led by Dr. Anya Singh of Natural Resources Canada stepped off a helicopter onto a coordinates marker in the Columbia Mountains. This location is not random. It is one of 64 snow core sites in the Canadian Rockies with more than 70 years of continuous manual measurement. It is a geological reference point for the health of Western Canada's water tower. On this date, the day the snowpack should be at its absolute peak, storing water for the entire summer, they found nothing. At 60 of the 64 sites surveyed across the region, the reading was the lowest ever recorded in history. At 18 of those sites, including locations above 2,500 meters, the reading was 0. Not a shallow layer, absolutely no snow. The data from the iconic Ymir Creek snow course in the central Kootenay region provides the context. This site had never been snowless on April 1st in its entire recorded history. Its previous worst reading was 16.5 centimeters in 2012. This year, the surveyors stood on bare dirt. Dr. Sarah Tremblay, lead hydrologist for the BC Snow Survey, released a statement that confirms the scientific consensus everyone was desperate to avoid. Based on the spatial and temporal distribution of data from both manual and automated stations, it is now safe to conclude that this is the absolute worst year for snowpack accumulation and water storage in Western Canadian recorded history. To understand the scale of what is unfolding, we must examine the deep geophysical system. Every spring, the Canadian Rocky and Columbia mountains release an ocean of melted snow. This water flows downhill, feeding major rivers like the Columbia, which then pour into some of the largest hydroelectric and water storage systems in the world. The entire system depends on a single variable: snow falling in the mountains through the winter and melting slowly through the spring. That snow never arrived, and what little did fall was destroyed by a convergence of warm temperatures and the phenomenon known as the dust on snow effect. Data from shows how high wind events during the winter carried desert dust not from Mexico, but from the drought-stricken exposed soils of the Canadian prairies, and even as far as the dried-up interior basins of British Columbia, depositing it onto the mountain snowfields. This layer of dark material absorbs more solar radiation. In a normal year, this accelerates the melt by up to 6 weeks. In 2026, it hit a snowpack that was already at record lows. The winter of 2025 to 2026 was not just dry, it was unprecedentedly warm. Whatever snow did accumulate was structurally weak, prone to immediate collapse, and melted weeks ahead of schedule. We have essentially experienced a winter without water storage. The numbers are terrifying. The statewide snow water equivalent on April 1st had averaged 8 centimeters. The historic median for this date is over 35 centimeters. The previous record worst year was 2012, when the reading was 23 centimeters. That means 2026 has less than 40% of the water stored in its snowpack compared to the year that was already the worst in Western Canadian history. The spring runoff forecast from ECC's Water Survey of Canada projects the Columbia River and its tributaries will deliver just 38% of their normal inflow to the critical Canadian reservoirs between April and July. This is not a drought, it is a fundamental, structural failure of the water supply for half a country. This is where the crisis collides with massive, unyielding infrastructure. Follow the water downstream from the high Rockies into the sprawling Columbia River system, the backbone of Western Canada's energy and water supply. At 1,475 megawatts, Mica Dam is a monstrous pillar of BC Hydro's generation capacity, creating the 130-kilometer-long Kinbasket Lake. Today, Kinbasket sits at roughly 711 meters of elevation, which is just 24% of its total storage capacity. The most probable forecast shows the reservoir declining to 707 meters by December. That number is not just low, it is the minimum power pool. Below 707 meters, the hydraulic pressure is insufficient. Glen Canyon Dam in the US faced this scenario, but now Mica is tracking toward it. For the first time, Mica Dam is facing the real risk of losing the ability to generate electricity, potentially knocking off enough power to supply 1.4 million homes in the middle of winter. The situation is equally critical further downstream. Lake Revelstoke's surface sits at 573 meters. It lost over a meter in March alone. The Revelstoke Dam, once capable of generating nearly 2,500 megawatts, is operating at vastly reduced capacity. In Western Canada, this is an energy crisis, a water crisis, and an ecological crisis occurring simultaneously. But here is the problem that is not making headlines. This is not just a geological or hydrological story. It is a political crisis, running in parallel with a physical emergency, and neither is being solved. This system was designed for a different era. The Western Canadian Water Allocation Accord, the fundamental agreement dividing water among the provinces and territories, was signed in 1922. It was based on flows recorded during an unusually wet decade, and it allocated nearly 18.5 billion cubic meters per year for use. But over the last 26 years, during the longest mega drought in modern Canadian history, the river has averaged only 15.4 billion cubic meters. The system has been structurally over-allocated since the day it was signed. There was never enough water for all the promises that were made, and now we are out of time. The provinces and territories are supposed to negotiate new binding rules for how to share what is left. On February 14, 2026, the 7 parties missed a federal deadline to agree on post-2026 operating guidelines. Honorable Jean-François Dubois, British Columbia's Minister of Land, Water and Resource Stewardship, described the impasse in blunt terms. We have received one consistent message from our counterparts. There will be no firm commitment to reduce their water usage, no matter how dire the conditions on the river may be. We are being asked to solve a problem we did not create with water we do not have. On the other side, Honorable Fiona MacLeod, Alberta's Minister of Environment and Protected Areas, pushed back, stating, "We are already delivering less water downstream because there is physically less water available. We cannot guarantee in writing the delivery of a resource that climate change is actively taking away." Neither side is budging. The federal government has announced that it will move forward with the regulatory process unilaterally with a final deadline of October 1st. If the provinces cannot reach an agreement, mandatory unprecedented water reductions will be imposed by Ottawa. At least one province is already expected to sue, which means this crisis could end up before the Supreme Court of Canada. While the politicians and lawyers debate, the reality is overwriting daily life for millions. For the first time, we are seeing the direct coupling of mountain snowpack health and urban sustainability. In Vancouver, the regional district, Metro Vancouver, has issued an urgent water warning. They are monitoring the Capilano, Seymour and Coquitlam reservoirs, which are also fed by dramatically reduced coastal snowpack. But the scale of the interior failure is what has water managers deeply concerned for the province's overall water balance. The city of Kelowna provides a terrifying microcosm. In March 2026, the Board of Water Commissioners declared a Stage 1 drought. But the conditions collapsed so fast that within 3 weeks they skipped Stage 2 and 3, plunging directly into Stage 4. This is a level of restriction never before implemented in Western Canada. Imagine a city under Stage 4. All outdoor watering is banned. Restaurants must serve water only upon customer request. Car washes and aesthetic water features are shut down. This is not about saving water for later. It is about preventing the complete depressurization of the municipal system. Liam O'Sullivan, Kelowna's Director of Water Services, provided a jarring assessment. This will be the year that people in British Columbia really learn the value of water. This is not temporary. This is our new operating reality. My office witnessed homeowners associations turning on their sprinklers in February, 2 full months before the growing season, while the worst snowpack collapse in our history was unfolding in the mountains directly above them. The level of public cognitive dissonance is as terrifying as the hydrological data. The impact is even more severe for indigenous nations. The Ktunaxa Nation, located in the Kootenay region of southeastern BC, has an ancestral and legal right to the waters of the Columbia and its tributaries, rights that predate any interprovincial compact, yet they are among the hardest hit. The Secwepemc Nation in the Thompson River Basin is facing similar challenges, as salmon runs face devastation in overheated low-flow rivers. We are talking about potential damages in the hundreds of billions of Canadian dollars. The agricultural sector in Alberta and Saskatchewan is bracing for complete crop failures on a scale not seen since the 1930s. Interprovincial logistics are at risk. As river levels drop, hydroelectric power generation plummets, potentially causing cascading failures across the Western Interconnection power grid, impacting everything from hospital services to telecommunications for millions of Canadians. The time for hoping for a miracle has passed. Here is what remains unresolved, and the variables are all trending the wrong way. The has confirmed that no late-season storm can fix this. We would need a historically improbable wet April just to make a meaningful difference, and ironically, even that would carry its own catastrophe risk. Given the complete lack of a snowpack to buffer runoff, any intense rain event would trigger widespread, devastating flooding, as the water would hit bare, dry earth and immediately pour into already weakened river channels. As summer approaches, the risk of massive wildfire escalation is skyrocketing. Mountains without snowpack dry out months earlier, becoming ready to ignite by May rather than July. The spring runoff that was supposed to fill two of Canada's most critical hydroelectric reservoirs is arriving at barely a third of normal volume. The 7 Canadian provinces and territories are further apart on a shared vision than they have been in decades. Can the October deadline force an agreement when 2 prior deadlines failed, or will we see a constitutional crisis over water? What happens to the inherent water rights of 30 different tribal nations whose legal authority is now on a collision course with a dried-up reality and provincial claims? At what precise elevation does a massive hydroelectric dam like Mica stop being a producer of renewable energy for a nation and become just a massive concrete wall holding back nothing? Right now, the snow that was supposed to save Western Canada is already gone. The reservoirs are dropping, and somewhere high in the Canadian Rockies, a snow course telemetry station that has been monitored every April for 70 years is sitting in full, dry sun, reading 0 for the first time, while 40 million people downstream wait for water that is simply not coming. At 7:22 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on February 14, 2026, the silence from the interprovincial negotiation room in Ottawa signaled a transition from a manageable drought to a national security emergency. This was the moment the federal deadline for a new Columbia River Treaty and domestic water sharing agreement expired without a single signature. But while the politicians stalled, the physical Earth was already providing a much more violent set of data points. Seismologists and geodesists at the Geological Survey of Canada, GSC, began noticing a bizarre signature on GNSS, Global Navigation Satellite System arrays, positioned across the southern interior of British Columbia and the Alberta Rockies. The mountain crust was actually rising. High-precision sensors near Golden and Revelstoke recorded a vertical displacement, a crustal rebound, of 3.4 centimeters in just 90 days. This is not tectonic uplift in the traditional sense. It is the lithosphere reacting to the sudden catastrophic loss of mass. Over 100 gigatons of water, which should have been pressing down on the Canadian Cordillera in the form of frozen snowpack, simply never materialized. The mountains are lighter because the water is gone. The geophysical autopsy of the 2025 to 2026 winter reveals a coupled system failure. It wasn't just that the atmospheric rivers failed to make landfall, it was that the ground itself had become a heat sink. Data from Natural Resources Canada's Soil Moisture Monitoring Network showed that going into the winter, the subsurface layers across the Kootenay and the Okanagan were at their lowest saturation levels since the 1930s. When the meager snow did fall, the desiccated earth beneath it acted like a thermal sponge, wicking away the base layer of the snowpack through sublimation and ground-level melting. Then came the albedo collapse. Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, tracked a series of high wind events in January and February that scoured the dry, exposed soils of the Caribou Plateau and the parched Alberta prairies. This mineral dust was lofted into the atmosphere and deposited across the high-altitude glaciers of the Selkirks and Monashi ranges. The impact was immediate. In a normal Canadian winter, the high albedo of clean white snow reflects 80% of solar radiation back into space. By March 2026, the dust on snow effect had turned the peaks a dull, bruised brown. This darkened surface began absorbing 60% more solar energy. Monitoring stations at 2,200 meters elevation recorded surface snow temperatures rising to the melting point even when the ambient air was still minus 5 degrees Celsius. The snow didn't just melt, it was structurally annihilated from both the top and the bottom simultaneously. At 11:45 a.m. on March 12, a critical telemetry node at the Blackcomb Snow Pillow, a station with decades of reliable data, recorded a catastrophic phase change. The entire remaining snowpack, nearly 40 centimeters of water equivalent, vanished into the soil and atmosphere in less than 72 hours. Dr. Elena Vance, a lead researcher at the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium, PCIC, in Victoria, described the monitoring data in a leaked internal memo as the signature of a dying system. According to Vance, we are seeing harmonic tremors in the hydrological cycle. The feedback loops have shifted from negative to positive. The less snow we have, the more dust is exposed. The more dust we have, the faster the remaining ice disappears. It is a runaway train. This is not a slow-motion crisis anymore. It is happening in real time. By April 1st, the peak of the Canadian water year, the 130 monitoring stations across the upper Columbia and Fraser basins were reading 0%. This is a number that scientists previously thought was statistically impossible for high-elevation Canadian peaks in April. The infrastructure is not built for this. The Mica Dam, a 243-meter-tall titan of Canadian engineering, was designed with a minimum power pool of 707 meters. This is the dead zone, the elevation below which the intake towers can no longer safely draw water into the massive turbines without risking cavitation and permanent structural damage. On April 5, 2026, real-time sensors from BC Hydro showed the Kinbasket Lake Reservoir dropping at a rate of 12 centimeters per day. At this trajectory, Mica, the cornerstone of the Western power grid, will hit the dead zone by early August. There is no backup. There is no alternative reservoir to tap. The 7-state water crisis in the US was a warning that Canada failed to heed. Now, the structural failure of the water supply is a mathematical certainty. The system is no longer in a drought. It is in a state of terminal exhaustion, and the technical data suggests the worst is yet to come, as the heat of July approaches an already bare mountain range. To understand the sheer magnitude of the 2026 collapse, we must look beyond the immediate data and into the deep history of the Canadian West. The current crisis is not an outlier. It is the culmination of a century of hydrological miscalculation. When the original water allocation frameworks were drafted in the early 20th century, engineers used a period of record-breaking precipitation as their baseline. They built a civilization on a statistical mirage. Historical data reconstructed from tree-ring chronologies in the Canadian Rockies by the University of Saskatchewan's Global Institute for Water Security suggests that the Big Dry of the 1930s, which devastated the Pallisers Triangle across Alberta and Saskatchewan, was actually a minor event compared to the multi-decadal megadroughts of the medieval period. What we are seeing in 2026 is the return of those ancient, scorched cycles, now amplified by a modern omega block atmospheric pattern that has effectively walled off the Pacific moisture corridor for 18 consecutive months. The science of this failure is rooted in coupled system dynamics. In a normal year, the Rocky Mountain cryosphere acts as a giant high-altitude battery, storing energy in the form of ice and releasing it as life-sustaining flow during the heat of summer. But in 2026, the battery is not just empty, the casing has melted. The Geological Survey of Canada, GSC, has reported that the Peyto Glacier and the Athabasca Glacier, vital headwater sources for the North and South Saskatchewan rivers, have entered a terminal retreat phase. The loss of the surrounding seasonal snowpack has stripped these glaciers of their protective insulation. Without the reflective white shield of winter snow, the ancient blue ice is exposed to 24-hour solar radiation. In July 2025, the Athabasca Glacier lost an average of 12 centimeters of vertical thickness per day. By May 2026, that rate has doubled. This is a geophysical feedback loop. As the ice thins, the surrounding rock heats up, further accelerating the melt. But there is a darker, more volatile twist that scientists are only now beginning to quantify. It is the hydroseismic link. For decades, the massive weight of water behind dams like the WAC Bennett Dam on the Peace River or the Mica Dam on the Columbia has exerted billions of tons of downward pressure on the Earth's crust. This is known as reservoir-induced seismicity. As the 2026 drought empties these reservoirs at an unprecedented rate, that pressure is being rapidly removed. Seismologists at the GSC have detected an alarming increase in microseismicity along the Rocky Mountain Trench, a 1,600 km-long fault system. As the crust rebounds from the loss of water weight, it is unclamping dormant faults. On April 14, 2026, a magnitude 4.2 tremor centered near the Kinbasket Lake Reservoir sent a shockwave through the engineering community. It wasn't just a quake, it was a warning that the geological stability of our hydro infrastructure is tied to the water levels we are failing to maintain. The numerical models from Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, are equally grim. The Canadian Seasonal to Interannual Prediction System, CanSIPS, shows a 92% probability that the ridiculously resilient ridge, a high-pressure system parked over the BC coast, will remain stationary through the end of 2026. This creates a heat dome effect that mimics the deadly 2021 Lytton event, but on a continental scale. The coupled impact on the prairies is catastrophic. The South Saskatchewan River, which provides water for nearly 70% of Saskatchewan's population and its critical potash mining and agricultural sectors, is currently flowing at just 22% of its historic median. The Lake Diefenbaker Reservoir, the lifeline of the province, is approaching its dead storage level. This is not a temporary fluctuation. The GSC's paleoclimate records indicate that when the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, PDO, and the Arctic Oscillation, AO, lock into this specific configuration, the resulting drought can last for decades. We are witnessing the permanent shifting of the Canadian hydroclimatic boundary. The lush, water-rich image of the Canadian West is being replaced by stark, high-desert reality. At the current rate of depletion, the total economic impact on Canadian GDP is projected to exceed 150 billion Canadian dollars by the end of the year, driven by the collapse of hydrogeneration, the death of the canola and wheat exports, and the skyrocketing cost of municipal water hauled by rail to stranded communities. The maps are being redrawn, and for the first time in Canadian history, the one resource we always assumed was infinite is proving to be our most dangerous vulnerability. The data is clear. The 2026 collapse is not just the worst year on record. It is the first year of a new, drier era for which no Canadian city is prepared. As the geophysical collapse of 2026 accelerates, the abstract data of the water tower failure is transforming into a visceral, daily struggle for survival across Western Canada. The human cost is being tallied not just in dollars, but in the permanent displacement of communities and the erasure of a way of life. In the agricultural heartland of southern Alberta, near the town of Medicine Hat, Sarah and Thomas Miller represent the front line of this catastrophe. For 3 generations, the Millers have farmed 4,000 acres within the Palisades Triangle, relying on the St. Mary River Irrigation District. In May 2026, for the first time since the district's inception, the head gates remained closed. You look at the Rockies and they are brown in May, Thomas says, standing in a field where the topsoil is turning into a fine alkaline powder. We have 2.8 million Canadian dollars in equipment sitting idle, and the bank doesn't care that there is no snow in the Kootenays. We aren't just losing a crop, we are losing the land itself to the wind. Public Safety Canada estimates that if the current trajectory holds, the total agricultural loss across the prairies will exceed 45 billion Canadian dollars this season alone, triggering a food security crisis that will be felt at every grocery store from Halifax to Victoria. The crisis is equally acute in the urban corridors of British Columbia. Marc-André Lefebvre, a senior logistics coordinator for the Port of Vancouver, is facing a nightmare scenario that no one in the maritime industry was prepared for: the salt wedge. Because the Fraser River is flowing at a record low volume, barely 30% of its historic May average, there is not enough freshwater pressure to push back the tide of the Pacific Ocean. The dense, saline seawater is creeping up the riverbed toward New Westminster and Delta. We are seeing salinity levels at the freshwater intakes for the city of Richmond that are 5 times the safe limit, Marc-André explains. If that salt wedge reaches the main pumps, the entire municipal water system of the Lower Mainland could be structurally compromised. We are talking about 3 million people without drinking water because the mountains didn't deliver the runoff. The cost to desalinate or relocate municipal intakes is estimated at 12 billion Canadian dollars, a project that would take years to complete. In the interior, the ecological toll is being measured by scientists like Dr. Juliana Desjarlais, a biologist with the Geological Survey of Canada and Parks Canada, who has spent 20 years monitoring the Kokanee salmon of the Kootenay Lake system. The silent die-off of 2026 is unlike anything she has witnessed. The water temperature in the tributaries hit 23 degrees Celsius in mid-May. That is a thermal ceiling for salmonids, Dr. Desjarlais notes while inspecting a dry creek bed near Nelson. The lack of snowmelt means there is no cold water pulse to regulate the river temperatures. We aren't just looking at a bad year for fish. We are looking at the total extirpation of these populations. The river is essentially a warm, stagnant pond. The loss of this keystone species ripples through the entire ecosystem, affecting everything from grizzly bear populations to the indigenous food sovereignty of the Ktunaxa and Secwepemc nations. The energy grid, the literal lifeblood of Western Canada, is vibrating with instability. The Alberta Electric System Operator, AESO, and BC Hydro have entered an unprecedented emergency sharing protocol. On May 18, 2026, as temperatures in Edmonton spiked to 34 degrees, an early season heat dome, the grid nearly buckled. With Mica Dam and Revelstoke Dam operating at 40% capacity due to the lack of hydraulic head, British Columbia was unable to export the usual surplus to Alberta. We are seeing brownout conditions in Calgary and Red Deer, not because of a downed line, but because the fuel, the water, is missing, says a senior engineer at the AESO. The reliability of the Western interconnection is now tied to the depth of a snowpack that no longer exists. Telecommunications infrastructure is also under threat. The lack of moisture in the ground has reduced the effectiveness of grounding systems for cellular towers, leading to sporadic outages and increased vulnerability to lightning-induced fires. For the 30 tribal nations across the Columbia and Fraser basins, the 2026 collapse is a violation of the dish with one spoon principle and a direct threat to their inherent water rights. Chief Elias Kootenay of the Ktunaxa Nation has been vocal about the federal government's failure to include indigenous voices in the post-2026 negotiations. The provinces are fighting over who gets the last drop for their loans, while our sacred waters are being drained to keep the turbines spinning for cities hundreds of kilometers away, Chief Kootenay states. Our treaties predate their provinces, and our right to the water is absolute. If the October 1st deadline passes without recognizing our sovereignty over these headwaters, the legal battle will paralyze every water project in this country for a generation. As June 2026 approaches, the logistics of the crisis are becoming surreal. In the Okanagan Valley, the wine capital of Canada, Irrigation has been cut off entirely to protect municipal supplies. Vineyards that have stood for 50 years are withering in real time, with an estimated 4.5 billion Canadian dollars in viticulture assets at risk of total loss. The Canadian Pacific Kansas City (CPKC) and CN rail lines through the mountains are under constant thermal watch as the extreme heat and dry conditions cause rail expansion and sun kinks, increasing the risk of derailments in the very corridors where emergency water supplies would need to be moved. The entire Western Canadian economy is now a series of coupled vulnerabilities, each one waiting for the other to fail. The clock is not just ticking, it is echoing in the dry riverbeds of a nation that thought its water was eternal. As the calendar turns toward the inevitable October 1st deadline, the geophysical data suggests that 2026 is not a seasonal anomaly, but the first year of a permanent phase shift in the Canadian Cordillera. The new zero is now the baseline. The predictive models from Natural Resources Canada and the University of Northern British Columbia indicate a 70% probability that the snowpack will fail to recover to even 50% of its historic median in 2027. We are witnessing the desertification of the headwaters. The hydrological system of the West, which was built on the assumption of a predictable cryospheric storage and release cycle, is being replaced by a volatile flash flood and evaporation regime. The coupled risks are spreading across the continent through the Great Canadian Water Corridor. By late 2026, the depletion of the Rocky Mountain snowpack will have reached the terminus of the Mackenzie River in the Arctic, as the reduced flow from the Peace and Athabasca systems lowers the water table across the Northwest Territories, accelerating permafrost thaw and releasing gigatons of sequestered methane in a feedback loop that no policy can halt. The vulnerability of Canada's primary economic corridors is reaching a breaking point. At the port of Vancouver's Roberts Bank and the various terminals along the Fraser River, the lack of fresh water discharge has fundamentally altered the river's fluid dynamics. Without the seasonal freshet to flush out sediment, the deep-sea shipping channels are silting up at 4 times the normal rate. The cost of emergency dredging to keep Canada's Pacific Gateway open is projected to hit 800 million Canadian dollars per month by the winter of 2026. If the salt wedge continues its inland migration, it will not just poison municipal wells, it will begin the chemical degradation of the concrete and steel foundations of the Alex Fraser and Port Mann bridges through chloride-induced corrosion, a slow-motion structural catastrophe for the nation's most vital transportation links. The energy, food, water nexus is in a state of terminal collapse. In the Peace River District, the Side C Clean Energy Project, a multi-billion-dollar gamble on the future of Canadian hydro, is facing a filling failure. There is no longer enough surplus flow to bring the reservoir to its operational depth without completely dewatering the downstream ecosystems of the Peace Athabasca Delta, a UNESCO World Heritage Site already on the brink of ecological extinction. In Alberta, the abandonment of the dry belt is no longer a hypothetical. Internal documents from Public Safety Canada discuss the planned relocation of up to 150,000 residents from rural communities that will physically run out of water by the first frost of 2026. The Canadian Pacific and CN rail corridors are now the only thing keeping these towns alive, hauling industrial-scale water tanks in a desperate, expensive logistical breach. The geophysical reality is that the Earth's crust is still adjusting to the sudden mass unloading. The Geological Survey of Canada has established a network of temporary seismograph arrays along the Rocky Mountain Trench, monitoring what they call unclamping events. As the reservoirs hit record lows, the reduction in vertical stress is allowing tectonic plates to slip in ways not seen in the Holocene. The risk of a magnitude 6.0 or greater earthquake, triggered not by plate subduction but by hydrological depletion, is now a factor in every emergency response plan for the BC interior. We have reached a point where the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the lithosphere are all vibrating in a synchronized state of failure. On October 1st, 2026, the federal government will likely exercise its emergency powers under the Canada Water Act, imposing mandatory cuts that will pit province against province and industry against industry. But the data doesn't care about jurisdiction. The science tells us that the water is gone. The glaciers are in terminal collapse. The soil is hydrophobic and the sky is empty. The most telling detail remains that manual snow cores in the Selkirks. As the sun sets on the 2026 water year, the bare dirt of the mountains stands as a monument to the end of an era. We are no longer waiting for the disaster. We are living in the ruins of a hydrological cycle that supported 40 million people and a G7 economy. The mountains were supposed to be the bank, the snow was the currency, and today the account is empty. Follow the data, and it leads to a singular, inescapable conclusion. The West is out of time, and the water is not coming back.